Hello, I'm Roberta Lavin, your professor, and will guide you through this course. We are going to explore solving clinical puzzles. How do you do it? And how does research and evidence-based practice help us to answer puzzling questions? Our first week, we cover 3 chapters. Chapter 1 introduces nursing research and evidence-based practice. I highly encourage you to read through the chapters before watching the videos. Each chapter will provide you with some information that you will need to answer the discussion board prompts and begin writing your paper. Because this course is only 8 weeks and your paper is due in week 7, it is important to write a section of it each week. You should quickly notice that each discussion board helps to build or to obtain, analyze, and build sections of your paper. I know working nurses and nursing students are busy, so there is no busy work assigned in this course. Each assignment has a purpose. I have addressed 4 learning outcomes in this chapter. First, I want you to be able to define nursing science. Second, discuss the difference between experimental and non-experimental research design. Third, explain the nature of nursing science and how nurses understand and know facts. And finally, describe scientific reasoning, including the empirical character of science and objectivity in research. Let's start at the beginning with some definitions that will help you to identify the differences between nursing research and evidence-based practice. Both are important in providing the best patient care. So what is nursing science? Nursing science is the focus on phenomenon of humans as individuals or personal social groups and their health, including health status, health-related processes and behaviors, health outcomes, and dynamics of health. Evidence-based practice is the process used to review, analyze, and translate the latest scientific evidence. The goal is to quickly incorporate the best available research along with clinical experience and patient preference into clinical practice so nurses can make informed patient care decisions. This course is designed to introduce you to nursing science, research, and evidence-based practice. Each is dependent on how we observe the world, interact with it, and create truths and facts. In the search for truth and fact, one thing is clear. Research alone will affect change through the construction of reality, whether that construction is the product of the effects of the researcher on society or society on the researcher's choice of subject. The ultimate question is what is being studied and why. As nurse scientists, we should be studying outcomes to improve the quality of care. In nursing science, we should first think about practical operations and recognize there is a difference between common sense and scientific reasoning. How do you learn about nursing research and best practices? Some people learn through journals or the news media. Some people learn through social media, which is always dangerous and risky because you need to check your sources. Many of us learn through colleagues. A nurse does not learn a lot from thinking about nursing in the abstract, but rather as nurses, we learn about nursing science by trying to find out why nurses do what they do, why some things work better with patients, and what environment influences and impacts outcomes. It is not what nurse scientists or clinical nurses do in vague analogies, but by very carefully examining the details and the predictable patterns of interactions following every action taken by a nurse. We do it through looking at the evidence, considering the patient's needs, and examining our experiences. As nurses, we all play a role in research. Those roles vary. For some nurses, you are the person that comes up with the big idea that needs to be answered. Others gather information. They are the bedside nurse that collects the data for the researchers. We advise people on participation. We search for evidence related to practice problems. We participate in journal clubs and discussion groups at work. We serve as principal investigators of a research study, and we write, we publish, and we teach. Everybody has a role in nursing research. I always begin by cautioning my students that research only provides us some of the evidence. It certainly doesn't provide us all of the evidence. Many researchers will quickly tell you that quantitative research provides the best evidence. And yet we all know that Piaget did not do research that was dependent on statistical analysis of large studies. We also know that the best evidence can change quickly as methods and new knowledge become available, especially as related to new diseases, such as we saw with COVID. We know that during the COVID pandemic, we have seen knowledge grow rapidly, and as a result of this rapid growth of knowledge, what we thought was correct changed. For nurses, it was turning the patient over, having them face down, and that helped them to breathe better, something that we never thought of before. We didn't routinely do. Then there is the research that manages to be published and is later shown to be inaccurately analyzed. And we've also seen this during the COVID pandemic. Most of it unintentional, some of it, well, we can question whether it was intentional or unintentional. Nursing research is generally conducted in one of two paradigms. A paradigm is a philosophical or a theoretical framework that gives us a perspective of how something works. The post-positive paradigm emphasizes the rational and the scientific. The constructivist paradigm describes the constructivism philosophical paradigm as an approach that asserts that people construct their own understanding and knowledge of the world through experiencing things and reflecting on those things. Each of these has research methods that are associated with them. We will discuss some of those methods throughout the semester. Assumptions are those things that are believed to be true without verifying them to be true. Not surprisingly, the assumptions for the different paradigms are often different. This, in turn, influences the type of research question. For example, nature is ordered and regular. Reality exists independent of human observation. In determinism, you might say phenomena are not random, but rather they have logical causes that occur before them. If I have a deterministic perspective on my approach to research, then you would expect me to have an approach that is very controlled so that research is precise. Kind of like the British Bake Off, Master bakers approach to baking with this very precise measures as opposed to mine, which is more of a Zen approach that feels right. I'm not a believer that every thing that goes into a cake or a casserole has to be measured and weighed. Sometimes you just toss in a pinch or a handful. The same type of different approaches occur in science. Let's think of pressure ulcers as a phenomenon. One approach to understanding a phenomenon such as pressure ulcers is through an experiment. An experiment is used to study causal relationships by manipulating one or more independent variables and measuring the effect on the dependent variable. Or simply stated, an experiment is a research study where different things are done to different subjects to see whether what is done results in different outcomes. So says Kurlinger, who is one of my favorite writers about research. There are two approaches to research studies, experimental and non-experimental designs. Before we move on to experimental and non-experimental design, stop for a moment. Can you name a phenomenon in nursing research? Take a few seconds. See what you come up with. The two types of research designs we're going to discuss for right now are experimental and non-experimental. An experimental design requires the manipulation of an independent variable and random assignment of subjects. In addition, it is ideal to have one or more control groups. This is common in drug studies and studies of new medical treatments. In a non-experimental design, there is no manipulation of variables. The nurse scientist may be interested in cancer in soldiers, but examine it by looking at medical records of patients over time who experienced a shrapnel injury. The researcher may look at two or more variables and the relationship between them, but they do not manipulate those variables. A third approach to research is qualitative design. And there are some common forms of qualitative design: phenomenology, ethnography, grounded theory, historical, and case studies. We're going to discuss these in some detail when we get to the section on qualitative research. We will discuss them in chapters 10 and 11. Qualitative research is important in nursing because it provides insight into how nurses and patients experience the world as it is, the world that we live in as we live in and experience it. We all know as nurses, it's impossible to control everything in our interaction with patients. Yet in experimental research, they do everything they can to put massive amounts of controls in place so that you know what independent variable is affecting what dependent variable. In nursing, that's often impossible for us. Qualitative studies tend to be in the natural setting where data is collected by the researcher. They tend to collect data in the form of interviews, observations, and documents, and use a vast array of approaches including narrative research, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case studies. They analyze the data by looking for patterns, categories, and themes with the focus on learning from the participants and the meaning the participants give to the information. Now, this is important to us as nurses because in many ways, this is what we're doing every day when we're assessing patients. We're looking for the themes, and we're analyzing the themes we're seeing in patients. So for a lot of nurse researchers, this approach comes more naturally to them and their work environment. When you get to the point in the semester that you are asked to find qualitative and quantitative articles, you may find this table helpful to identify the differences. I did provide you the link to where the table originated, and you can find other information that's useful at that link. But I think looking at the difference between qualitative and quantitative research is really important. Qualitative research tends to be exploratory research to establish a base of insights on a key topic area. It helps us to understand underlying motivations, attitudes, and perceptions, and provides insight into problem definition, providing hypothesis, and language for subsequent quantitative evaluation. These studies tend to be smaller, a small number of participants, and they do not use statistics. If you find statistics other than demographic information in a study, you can assume it is not qualitative. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is used to quantify data and generalize results to a target audience. It measures the incidence of motivation, attitude, and perceptions. It has big benchmarks and track data over time. It can predict future behavior with caution. And it helps us to understand between target audience segments. These studies tend to be large, and they almost always use statistics. How do we know in nursing? And by this, I mean, how do you understand what is going on with your patients and in the world around you? That is always key, but it isn't everything. It's not complete. Education, practice, experience, and the values of our patients and communities and tradition also play important roles. And nurses we should always heavily weigh professional knowledge and evidence that is supported by data. I know that if you haven't heard already, someday you will hear, but that's the way we've always done it. That's the way we've always done it is a really concerning answer. It means the person hasn't really considered why they're doing what they're doing. There are things we should be aware of and that will apply to some, not all. For example, the Dunning-Kruger effect is the cognitive bias that results in people with low skills that overestimate their ability and people with high skills underestimating their ability. Students, for example, sometimes estimate their ability higher than skilled nurses estimate theirs. It's very common for the new nurse to feel more confident than the more experienced nurse that's been around for a while. We also need to recognize that not all data is of equal quality. Some of it is pretty bad. Also, not all facts will remain facts. New discoveries can change what we consider to be fact. This doesn't mean that a researcher was dishonest. It just means we learned something new that changed the way we viewed the world. New discoveries can change what was considered to be a fact. This is different from people online without adequate training that try to read a medical or research article and totally misinterpret the meaning and then go on to spread false information. And we have all seen this extensively over the last few years. The common one, wearing a mask does no good. Really? I mean, at this point in time, if you think masking does no good, you probably haven't really, with an open mind, read the evidence. Likewise, people that think vaccines do no good have not really read the evidence on the massive number of lives that vaccinations have saved. Everything from using vaccinations to eradicate smallpox to the number of children's lives that measles, mumps, and rubella have changed, to polio vaccines that got rid of the massive iron lung units that we used to have because so many people had polio. But not all evidence is good, and some evidence is bad. There are researchers that have been accused and proven to falsify information. And later in the semester, we will discuss that in more detail. Let's talk a little bit about scientific objectivity and confirmation bias. What is scientific objectivity, and what elements are necessary for scientific objectivity? Scientific objectivity expresses the idea that the claims, methods, and results of science are not or should not be influenced by particular perspectives, values, commitments, community bias, or personal interest, and are free from systemic bias. I adapted this list from Steniga and Springer. It is often presumed to be easier to assume scientific objectivity in an experimental design. Qualitative research is an area where it is most important to address scientific objectivity because the research is taking the response of open-ended questions and interpreting them. It is not possible for the researchers to entirely withdraw from the interpretation that comes from their own background knowledge and values. Though one could argue that even in experimental design, the perspective of the researcher and their background influence the design. Finally, there is always the risk of confirmation bias. It seems to be human nature to attempt to support our own beliefs and values. In research, when the researcher seeks or interprets evidence in a way that is partial to existing beliefs, expectations, or hypotheses, that is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias can occur because the researcher consciously or unconsciously seeks out and uses evidence that support his or her hypothesis and discounts the evidence that does not support the hypothesis. Every semester, I have at least one student that asks if they should only use articles that support their work. The answer is no, absolutely not. This is confirmation bias, and it is not helpful in improving care. I will add to this a recent example I had. Some colleagues and I did this research article that got us hate mail because people didn't like the outcomes of the study. Nurses didn't like the outcomes of the study. Rather than looking at the data and accepting that it was the data, they wanted to say that it was bad because they didn't like the methods and suggested all these things that support their beliefs. You can't do that in science. In science, you have to look at all the data that supports you and the data that contradicts you. And you have to look at it all, and you have to look at it with an open mind, even when it comes up, as it did in this case, with a result that shocked me, was not what I expected, and did not make me happy that it was the finding about a profession I love. You have to put away your biases when you look at the data, and you have to look at all the evidence, not just the evidence that support you. As always in my class, I have office hours. I have office hours twice a week, and everyone is welcome to join. If you are in my class, I highly encourage you to come to office hours and ask questions. I am always willing to go into much more detail in those periods of time, usually because there's interested people that want to know more. And we can do that. We can go over the questions you have and anything that you find confusing. In the meantime, you have my email. You all have my cell phone number and can text me any questions that you have. I hope you enjoy the semester.